My name is John Durham-Peters. I'm in film and media studies and English here, and an affiliate in history of science and medicine. I'm also an incoming member in the Terry Committee. So I'm grateful to Deborah Cohen for the opportunity to introduce Professor Daston. A friendly reminder that the third and final lecture will take place Friday, not tomorrow, and not here, but in Rosenfeld 109. And I should read this before we begin. I remind you that Yale is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. Interfering with the speaker's ability to speak and the audience's ability to hear and see is not consistent with the university's free expression policy. I'm also grateful to Debbie for giving a fuller overview of Professor Daston's stunning career yesterday, so I'll be more personal. I first heard of Lorraine Daston in the year 2000, sitting in the office of Friedrich Kittler, the great media theorist, in Berlin. And since then, I've always thought of her as a kind of media historian, or rather, at least a model of what media historians might aspire to be. She was a chief influence on a book that I co-wrote with my deceased colleague, Kenneth Camille, the cultural and intellectual historian. This book was called Promiscuous Knowledge, a book that had the misfortune to appear in March 2020, when people definitely had other things on their mind. The title suggests not that knowledge is impossible, but that it is overflowing, that it can break out of whatever containers we try to shoehorn it into, and that different periods experience this as a crisis in different ways. This was, I like to hope, a rather Dastonian approach to the history of knowledge. There's much to be said about her intellectual leadership at the Max Planck Institute, which has shaped generations of scholars and set the agenda globally, about her contributions to the analysis of images of all kinds, not only scientific ones, and about her gift of hauling obscure figures out of the library into a much expanded pantheon. I want to stress especially her inexhaustible love for the squirrely particulars of the world. Her readers will learn about smelters, the rules of chess, long-distance trade routes, Barbados molasses, and champagne. And that is just page 61 of the recent wonderful book, Rules, A Short History of What We Live By. Professor Daston was not by accident one of the rediscoverers of the relevance of the Renaissance cabinet of curiosities in the 1990s, which soon became an all-purpose metaphor for the bric-a-brac collections of the online universe and of a planet continually crowded with human artifacts. Particulars, she quotes Aristotle, have no end. Over and over in her analyses, particulars abound, astound, outrun, overwhelm, and stymie the overweening universals that think they can tame them. And yet the universals don't lose in the process. They are essential to it. She believes in reason and in craft, and the process is enormously educational. Universals become lighter, more informed, more flexible. Maybe I should use this troubled word, smarter. Lorraine Daston is both an impish collector of curiosities and an intimidating constructor of arguments. Both historian and philosopher, friend to shipbuilders and mathematicians, illustrators and weavers. She likes the between spaces, between head and hand, theory and practice, typical forms and idiosyncratic individuals. With Peter Gallison, she famously wrote in Objectivity, all epistemology begins in fear. Fear that the world is too labyrinthine to be threaded by reason. I've truncated the quote, but note the perfect word threaded, suggesting handicraft, stitching, knowing practice. The takeaway I want to leave you with is a set of attitudes Professor Daston embodies that I admire boundlessly. There's an aesthetic attitude. Everything is interesting, potentially. A moral one, too. Boredom is unnecessary. And our lack of appreciation for the work of others is insulting to their intelligence. But perhaps most of all, a metaphysical attitude. That even if the universe might ultimately defy our descriptions, we can nonetheless learn an enormous amount about it as we study the history of attempts to make sense of it. Every page of her work is a performance of facing down the demons of fear, of ignorance and skepticism, a performance of the confidence that erudition matters and is even possible, indeed on an encyclopedic scale. I'm grateful for the epistemic faith you enact and the wonders and orders you unfold for all of our admiration and belonging. Professor Daston.
John, thank you for that. I want "boredom is unnecessary" inscribed on my tombstone. Try to live up to that. I'm going to begin with one of those characters redeemed from obscurity of history. The biggest terrestrial phenomenon ever observed. That was the verdict of the French astronomer and science popularizer Camille Flammarion on the eruption of Krakatoa in August of 1883 on an island in the Sunda Strait between the islands of Java and Sumatra in what is now Indonesia. Flammarion actually exaggerated. There had been an even more violent volcanic eruption within human memory, such as the 1815 Tambora eruption, also in present-day Indonesia, which darkened the atmosphere with around 100 cubic kilometers of dust and caused the notorious year without a summer all over the world in the following year. But Krakatoa erupted in the age of the telegram, which sent news of the unimaginable devastation wrought by the eruption and the ensuing 40-meter-high tsunami whizzing around the globe. Newspaper headlines and journals of learned societies all over the world described the deafening explosion heard as far away as Perth, Australia, 3,000 kilometers distant. The disappearance of 2/3 of the island of Krakatoa, which is circled here on the map. The disappearance also of coastal towns and villages swamped by the tsunami, which tossed ships and even locomotives as far as 3 miles inland, and the smoke and sulfurous fumes that turned daylight into an 18-hour-long night. The corpses of the tens of thousands of victims that choked the Sunda Strait, and the acoustic shockwave triggered by the eruption that raced 3 times around the world. High waves began arriving at the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of Africa without respect to the usual schedule of high and low tides. And starting in September and lasting well into the winter, observers from Bengal to France, Tasmania to Philadelphia, Norway to Venezuela stood stock still at sunset as the dust particles from the eruption, scattered by the jet stream to the upper atmosphere, set the sky ablaze and tinted the sun lavender and the moon green. These are some attempts to capture the effects at the time. The disaster became a global spectacle that transfixed millions with its scenes of mingled horror, terror, and wonder. But what did it all mean? Did it mean anything at all? I ended my first lecture with another scene of devastation almost exactly a century earlier in 1783, with the French naturalist, geologist, Déodat de Dolomieu, who was inspecting the ruins of cities in Calabria and Sicily destroyed by the earthquake. Like Flammarion, commenting on the 1883 Krakatoa eruption, Dolomieu's stated aim was to gather evidence for and against various competing hypotheses about the causes of earthquakes. And Flammarion was interested in much the same desideratum. He was writing in a book about volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, which he thought of as linked phenomena. That is, neither of them was there to report on the human costs of the death and devastation wrought by these disasters. Yet neither Flammarion nor Dolomieu succeeded in averting their eyes from the homes crushed like matchsticks, the thousands of people buried alive or swept out to sea, and the epidemics that broke out among the miserable survivors. Dolomieu tried to make sense of the fact that 40,000 people had been wiped out by what he called a slight effort of nature. Flammarion lamely argued that the blind nature that had snuffed out some 100,000 lives per century was a good deal less atrociously blind than the human wars that killed, by his estimate, 40 million people in the same time span. Both tried to take refuge in science. Both floundered. Could anyone really find solace in Flammarion's wan reassurance that the innocent victims of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions were, quoting Flammarion, like the Holocaust to the progress of science? He's using Holocaust here in the original Greek meaning of a burnt offering. Understanding the how of earthquakes and volcanoes gave absolutely no clue as to why. By the early 19th century, a new metaphysics had made the why of natural disasters unanswerable. Pre-modern explanations of disasters, as I explained in my first lecture, did not distinguish between the natural, the human, and the supernatural causes of these events. On the contrary, explanations regularly intermingled all three kinds of explanations. In contrast, the new metaphysics of the late 18th century enforced strict divisions amongst the human, the natural, and the supernatural. The supernatural, which was once ubiquitous in the explanation of disasters of all kinds, not just ones which we call natural disasters, but also human-caused disasters like enemy sieges. These causes were not banished, but they're now rarely invoked. The God of constant universal laws could no longer indulge in displays of wrath at human misconduct. Enlightenment theologians and natural philosophers had made local suffering into the price of global equilibrium. The Lisbon earthquake had, of course, been a tragedy for the residents of Lisbon. Some 50,000 people were estimated to have been killed in the earthquake and tsunami that followed, but it was a boon for farmers elsewhere in Europe because it raised the water tables. By favoring the universal immutability of God's wisely ordained natural laws over providential interventions in particular cases, the new metaphysics also created a new ethics of disasters, or rather an anti-ethics. Neither God nor humans were to blame for the death and misery inflicted by what were now called natural disasters, the very name advertising their innocence. Death and destruction were simply the unintended side effects of natural causes following inexorable natural laws. The natural disaster had become the prototype of blameless but also meaningless evil. So in my first lecture, I traced the long trajectory from Greco-Roman antiquity to the end of the 18th century in order to highlight the emergence of the distinctive category of the purely natural disaster. To be able to draw boundaries around certain kinds of misfortune and to give them their own special name after centuries of lumping together all bad things that afflicted many people, at once required a mighty metaphysical effort of segregation. So I will just very crudely symbolize this. Imagine three watertight boxes now, and we have divine causes, natural causes, human causes. Ideally, in this metaphysical dispensation, there's no commerce amongst these hermetically sealed boxes. But like all metaphysics, and like all boxes I know, there were leaks in the system. So one did often get inquiries about the meaning of natural disasters, just as even sermons preached would recommend that parishioners next time get insurance policies. But to a remarkable degree, the category of the purely natural disaster, for which neither God nor humans nor any other responsible moral agent could be blamed, reshaped thought and practice in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, and that is the subject of this lecture. I want to explore both in thought and practice, using the questions of blame and meaning, what kind of difference this meant for thinking about the metaphysics, but more really the ethics of natural disasters. So in the realm of thought, my subject matter will really here be an attempt to build a firewall between nature and ethics. And this is an effort which is still ongoing, as the late 20th century controversies over evolutionary ethics, sociobiology, and more generally what is called the naturalistic fallacy, or even the pathetic fallacy, testify. Although these controversies have had and still have very diverse political valences, some of them lean right, others lean left, the pattern of the argument on both sides is strikingly similar. So that's in the realm of thought. In the realm of practice, I turn to efforts of the law courts to apply the category of the act of God in Anglo-American law, force majeure in French and international law, höhere Gewalt in German, vis major in Roman law, these attempts to apply this category of what had come by the end of the 18th century to be applied almost solely to natural disasters, to actually apply it to specific cases. And sometimes these cases are of an absolute mind-numbing banality, like the damage that is caused when your neighbor's wading pool overflows after unusually heavy rains. But sometimes they are about tragedies not quite of Krakatoa proportions, but certainly of memorable proportions, like the great earthquake, the great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. So in both thought and practice, the challenge was to draw a bright line between human responsibility and natural irresponsibility, with natural disasters figuring as Exhibit A. The attempts to enlist the moral authority of nature in support of social, political, ethical orders dreamed up by humans is at once ancient and ongoing. It is persistent, it is pervasive. One reason, I think, why it's so very difficult, despite the efforts of centuries worth of philosophy, to cure us of this habit of trying to make nature the umpire in our own disputes, is because nature contains so many resources for analogies to this or that political order, this or that moral system, that it's a beckoning resource for everyone. So, to give just one example, proponents of monogamous marriage can cite the swans who pair for life. Their opponents counter with the mating habits of the praying mantis, and in which the female eats the head of the male during copulation. This is a kind of game that can go on and on and on, and that's one reason why I think the game has never stopped. The same can be said for what we might consider more stately and regular aspects of nature. For example, the inexorable or relentless, depending on your point of view, march of the celestial bodies through the ecliptic in the course of the year, which has inspired ethical systems from the ancient Stoics to the present. Even the inanimate world can be conscripted to serve as a reference point for these very human controversies. What's striking about the 19th and 20th century controversies about whose side nature is on is the emergence of a really qualitatively novel argument. So, one can find examples from Aristotle's discussion of the beehive as a monarchy. He thought it was the king bee rather than the queen bee, but the monarchy analogy has stuck. So from antiquity to the discussions of E.O. Wilson in sociobiology concerning how nature provides some kind of model or template or justification for human practices. So that is a kind of basso continuo of the invocation of the moral authority of nature. What's really interesting about the 19th century is, in this very long history, a new kind of argument appears. These arguments sought to make, at best, nature irrelevant to human and moral and political arrangements, and at worst, to argue that nature was positively abhorrent to human values. The previously benevolent figure of Mother Nature stood accused of crimes against humanity, and the prosecution's most damning evidence was the wanton death and destruction caused by natural disasters. So here is the British philosopher John Stuart Mill arguing in 1874 that nature has completely disqualified itself as a moral authority for human deeds. In sober truth, nearly all the things which men are hanged or imprisoned for doing to one another are nature's everyday performances. And goes on to say, either we kill because nature kills, torture because nature kills, or we just ignore nature and do what is good independent of nature. He is not alone in these kinds of attempts to build a firewall between nature and ethics. Historians of science have often read such moral sentiments as reactions to Charles Darwin's On the Origin of the Species, and Mill goes so far as to suggest that even our aesthetic response of the sublime to, for example, a volcano like Krakatoa, as long as it is observed at a safe distance, or the might of a hurricane, was a feeling in all cases more allied to terror than to any moral emotion. So this is a really extreme attempt to build a ring fence around nature as a resource for any kind of value, not just moral values, but also aesthetic values. As I said, there's a standard story in history, which is not entirely wrong, which is that these kinds of efforts are inspired by the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species in 1859, which puts the last nail in the coffin of the physico-theology I described in my lecture yesterday, namely the attempt to deduce the existence and benevolence of God from nature, the works of nature. I do not wish to deny the influence of Darwin, but this had been going on long, long before. What you can really see, and it's encapsulated by two famous snippets of poetry, is a transition from not only a rosy view about nature, but a positive call to nature to instruct us. This is a French revolutionary engraving in which you are instructed, do you want to be happy, listen to nature. And what nature represented here as the many-breasted Diana of Ephesus with reason gesturing toward the codex that she is holding. The codex is the droit de l'homme, the rights of man. So the idea here is that nature is our teacher in things political and moral, as well as in things more natural. So, and this is epitomized by the famous Alexander Pope couplet: "All nature is but art unknown to thee. all chance direction that thou canst not see, all discard harmony, not understood, all partial evil, universal good. So oppose that to Tennyson, writing in 1850, so 9 years before the publication of The Origin of the Species, who trusted God was love indeed, and love creation's final law, though nature red in tooth and claw, shrieked against his creed. Darwin's own spin, frankly, on his theory of evolution would have done Dr. Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide proud with its cheery optimism. He writes, nature acts only for her creatures' good. The direction of evolution is onward and upward, producing ever more perfect forms. I don't think that any straight line can be drawn between Darwin's Origin of the Species and the slowly crystallizing consensus that nature was not just alien to human desires and human values, but downright maleficent. Darwin's friend and defender, Thomas Henry Huxley, became notorious for his unflinching defense of Darwin's theory of evolution as it was applied to the human species. But even Huxley recoiled before the prospect of an evolutionary ethics. In his 1893 Romanes lecture, Huxley repudiated nature's amorality, writing, "Let us understand once for all that the ethical progress of society depends not on imitating the cosmic process, still less in running away from it, but in combating it." Or, as Flammarion put it in his survey of the causes of volcanoes and earthquakes like Krakatoa, it's a war, the war of the elements against humanity. This conviction that nature's savagery, most dramatically displayed in natural disasters like the eruption of Krakatoa, disqualified all appeals to nature in matters of moral, legal responsibility, and even, as in the case of John Stuart Mill's condemnation of the sublime, even aesthetics, found gloomy-doomy expression in a rash of fantasy novels envisioning the end of humanity in a mega-natural disaster. So there's Mary Shelley, this is the same Mary Shelley who wrote Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, in her book The Last Man, published in 1826, a global pandemic wipes out all but a handful of human survivors. The protagonist of H.G. Wells's Time Machine, published in 1895, fast forwards 30 million years to find life on Earth in its frozen death throes as the sun fades. William Hope Hodgson's The Nightland, published in 1912, also depicts the pathetic remnants of human life once the sun has succumbed to the heat death predicted by the second law of thermodynamics. And more obviously rooted in real natural disasters are paintings like this one by John Constable. It's in the famous Year Without a Summer, 1816. I mentioned at the outset the eruption of Tambora in 1815, and the resulting dust cloud darkened the sky for almost an entire year. This is Constable's noontime depiction of Weymouth Bay. Lord Byron wrote a poem called Darkness, in which he describes how the animals at noon, because it was so dark, went to roost. The Poisonous Purple Cloud of M.P. Shields' 1901 novel of that title originates from a volcanic explosion in the South Pacific, recalling Krakatoa and those lurid sunsets. Even Flammarion, the astronomer, had tried his hand at this genre in his La Fin du Monde, The End of the World, of 1894. He imagines the Earth hit by a comet. And because Flammarion is very much a kind of Troisième République anti-clerical intellectual, the comet hits right in Rome at the Vatican. it wipes out almost all life. Now, this is a genre which is very much with us, and literary scholars call it apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic fiction. But what's really interesting about these novels of the late 19th century and the early 20th century is that they no longer contain almost any reference to the biblical apocalypse that had peppered works earlier in the 19th century. There's neither damnation nor redemption, only the solitude and destruction of a few survivors in a blasted landscape. What's also striking about these so-called apocalyptic novels is the absence not only of the apocalypse, but also of the kind of disaster that had haunted the nightmares of earlier authors. So, for example, when the 17th century thought about horrendous disasters, they thought of an episode like the Great Fire of London of 1666, which wiped out much of the central city, or the Christmas floods of 1717 that killed some 14,000 people in Northern Europe. Now, floods and fires certainly did not disappear during the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, but they do disappear in this kind of fiction, this kind of disaster fiction, and they cede the stage to comets, to earthquakes, to volcanoes, and cosmic catastrophes like the dying sun. One reason they faded from the catastrophic imaginary was better technologies for defending densely populated areas against floods and fires, ranging from more effective dikes to the invention, this is a Dutch invention of the late 17th century, of the fire pump, and the organization actually of firefighting units in urban areas. And another was the provision of fire insurance, either by private companies or state-backed schemes. Again, this emerges first in the Netherlands in the late 17th century, and it's quite widespread by the 19th century, both fire and flood insurance. Now, such precautionary measures by no means eliminated the risk of fires or floods any more than better nutrition or life insurance eliminates the risk of death. But they did remove these disasters from the category of entirely blameless evils. Both courts of law and the courts of public opinion could charge flood and fire victims with irresponsibility and a culpable lack of foresight. Of course, the victims had not directly, in most cases, caused their misfortune, and they were certainly helpless to avert it once the disaster struck. But once the radius of reasonable foresight had been extended to include precautions such as maintaining dikes, not building homes in floodplains, not leaving hearth fires burning unwatched through the night, and not taking out insurance policies, victims could be reproached for their complicity in their own tragedies. One of the most famous cases, of course, is Mrs. O'Leary's cow and the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871. And in contrast, the comets and the earthquakes and the volcanoes and the dying sun that figure in this late 19th and early 20th century so-called apocalyptic fiction, these things remain beyond human powers to predict or control or even mitigate. They were pure instances of blameless evil caused by nature and only by nature. The boundary between these two kinds of natural disaster, those partially and those entirely beyond reasonable human precautions and control, was drawn and redrawn several times in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. I've already mentioned that advances in technology and science certainly played a role in these changes, at least for some of these natural disasters. The ability to predict hurricanes and cyclones has improved immensely since the beginning of the 20th century, but earthquakes still give only seconds of notice. Also influential were evolving political attitudes toward responsibility of the state, not only to the disaster victims, but also to fund early warning systems. I'm thinking here of the tsunami warning system that Japan has installed. And finally, the state has become the insurer of last resort. I'll say more about this in the third lecture. For example, the subsidized flood insurance rates of the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States, known as FEMA, to US home owners in low-lying, frequently inundated areas. So disputes about where to lay the blame for natural disasters, or whether the evil was truly blameless, played out certainly in philosophical treatises and scientific articles and political debates. But they also played out in the law courts. And I'd like now to turn to one of the most famous cases, namely the great San Francisco conflagration. I'll explain in a moment why it was called that. So early in the morning, on April 18th, 1906, the Harvard psychologist William James was thrown from his bed in Palo Alto, California, where he was a visiting professor at Stanford. James knew immediately that it was an earthquake. He had been forewarned by his Yale colleague, Charles Bakewell, a native Californian, to expect minor shocks that periodically jangled that part of the West Coast. And James' first reaction was that of a jubilant local tourist who had been granted a glimpse of a local attraction. He writes, "Here's Bakewell's old earthquake after all." And then, as it went crescendo, and a jolly good one it is, too. It must be said that James's jollity faded quickly when he went outside and started to take stock of the crumbling Stanford buildings. When he reached San Francisco 4 days later, he saw the city broken and charred, and the entire population in the streets, desperately trying to save themselves and whatever belongings they'd managed to salvage from their ruined homes, battered by the earthquake and singed by the fires that broke out minutes thereafter and raged for days. Headlines the day after the earthquake screamed, "Earthquake and fire, San Francisco in ruins," and the whole city is ablaze. And the next day, 300,000 are homeless, hungry, and helpless. The bread lines stretched for miles. Martial law was declared. Soldiers policed the streets to stop the looting. The streets echoed with the sound of dynamite, detonated to pull down crumbling buildings before they collapsed of their own accord and buried still more victims. When the fires were finally put out, a few days later, almost 30,000 buildings had been destroyed. Over half of the city's population was homeless. So San Francisco has a population of 410,000. You can imagine if 300,000 people are homeless. An area of 500 city blocks had been burned to the ground. Any able-bodied man seen by the soldiers was immediately conscripted to help clear the rubble. Because the earthquake had cracked the water mains, there was no potable drinking water. Rich and poor alike waited in long lines for bread. Some of the bread had been shipped from as far away as Utah. Rats stampeded through the streets, driven out into the open by the earthquake and the fires. One witness described the mass exodus on the way to the Golden Gate Park as a steady stream of women and children, men, women, and children. And since all of the wagons and automobiles had been commandeered by the military, the city was under martial law, baby carriages and toy wagons and even trunks mounted on roller skates were being dragged along by ropes. And this witness wrote, "No one who witnessed these scenes can ever forget the rumbling noise of the trunks drawn along the sidewalks, a sound to which the detonations of the dynamite blasting furnished a fitting contrapuntal accompaniment." The Richter scale for measuring the severity of earthquakes had not yet been devised in 1906, but seismologists retrospectively categorized the 1906 San Francisco quake as probably about 7.9 on the Richter scale, and extreme, that's category 11, on the Mercalli intensity scale. Over 3/4 of the city was destroyed. Some 3,000 people were estimated to have died in the quake and the ensuing fires caused by the ruptured gas lines. Now, horrific though that figure is, I want to remind you that it's a mere fraction of a tenth of the 40,000 estimated to have died in Krakatoa in 1883. But San Francisco was by then the largest and most prosperous city on the West Coast. It was a thriving center of trade and finance. It called itself the Paris of the West. The city was rich, really rich. It was rich enough to fill the Opera House the night before the earthquake for a performance by Enrico Caruso of Carmen. And its citizens were heavily insured. As the headlines and also the film segments by this time, there's not just the telegraph, but photography and even film that are recording the event, the disaster was commemorated and publicized in both words and images. For all of these reasons, the tragedy of San Francisco was documented and commemorated on a scale that dwarfs that of previous natural disasters, even ones an order of magnitude more destructive, like Krakatoa, whose victims were largely poor, largely unserved by modern metropolitan media, and crucially, they were uninsured. This disparity is almost as true now as it was then. However tragic the loss of life and property, a natural disaster creates barely a ripple in global markets and therefore in global memory if the victims are not insured. Here is Munich Reinsurance's map of relevant natural catastrophe loss events in 2021. Munich Reinsurance is the largest reinsurance company in the world, and I simply want to draw your attention to that word relevant. Relevant means that the people who suffered these disasters were insured and therefore show up in the insurance companies. So in the case of the San Francisco earthquake, insurance claims were being filed even before the smoke from the fires had cleared and the last teetering building hulk had been dynamited. Almost as quickly, the insurance companies began stipulating conditions. So martial law, and then we have, at first it looks rosy. The California insurance companies and also Lloyd's of London rushed to fill the claims. But as the magnitude of the damage began to sink in, the initial estimates were somewhere between $200 and $300 million, just absolutely colossal sums for that day. That would have been equivalent to almost 1% of the gross domestic product of the United States in 1900. As these figures begin to fill the minds of insurance executives with dread, you begin to get conditions. The insurance companies are not charitable institutions. Alarms begin to sound not only in insurance offices all over the United States, but also in Europe, because the European insurers were also heavily involved as bankruptcy loomed. And the lawyers for the insurance companies began to hold a magnifying glass to the fine print in those insurance policies. Damages caused by so-called acts of God were explicitly excluded. And if an earthquake was not an act of God, what was? So the insurance companies argue, look, we're very sorry, but we have excluded explicitly in our contract with you an act of God, and the earthquake is an act of God. The San Franciscans and the California politicians countered that the proximate cause of most of the damage was not the earthquake, but the fires that had been unleashed by the earthquake. And after all, fire insurance was very much part of these insurance policies. The insurance companies, once again, pointed to the explicit exclusion of earthquakes and other acts of God, and the San Franciscans retorted by saying, it was not the great earthquake, it was the great conflagration. This battle went on in the courts, not only in the United States, but also in Europe. And the long and the short of it is the insurance companies lost, and they've never forgotten this. I will be talking about Swiss reinsurance in my next lecture. It is still an event that makes the executives of Swiss reinsurance, so to speak, quake in their boots, San Francisco. The insurance companies, 19 of the major insurance companies in the world went bust as a result of paying out the claims for the San Francisco Great Conflagration. And unsurprisingly, the first reaction of the surviving insurance companies was to devote an unbelievable amount of legal energy to enforcing a hard and fast distinction between man-made and natural disasters. So man-made disasters generally are insurable, but natural disasters generally not. And this, I think, we can call metaphysics in action. How the courts rule on where to draw the line between blind nature, which could not be blamed, and culpable humans who most certainly could not. So these exclusionary clauses that the insurance companies wrangled over after the San Francisco earthquake invoke a number of legal terms. I've already mentioned them: act of God, force majeure, vis major. But they all basically are about the same things. I don't wish to minimize the difference in different legal traditions, continental and Anglo-American and elsewhere. But generally, although each of these terms has its own meandering history, common to all of them is the intent to release one party, at least one party, in this case the insurance companies, from its contractual obligations, in this case paying the damages, the claims for damages, on the grounds that an unforeseeable and irresistible event had intervened. In the case of the San Francisco event, let's call it, for the insurance companies, this is an earthquake. For the claimants, it's a fire. So just what constituted this kind of event is a moving target in the 19th and 20th century legal context, and it still is. So going back to the Great Fire of London in 1666, almost everybody would have considered that an act of God in 1666, perhaps without the resonances of divine wrath, but definitely something that was completely unforeseeable and beyond human powers to avert. By the end of the 19th century, that would have been considered an extremely weak defense. There were technologies of fire pumps, there were organized fire departments in most large cities, and there was fire insurance. So that's a case in which something which had previously been considered an act of God had been moved very much into the category of an act of human beings, and or at least something that for which the insurance companies could be held liable. They could not write exclusionary clauses about it. So the term act of God, which is first used in an English court in 1581, it begins to really change its meaning along the lines that I sketched in my first lecture by the end of the 18th century. It can still technically, and in international law it still does, refer to acts of terrorism, war, states of exception of all kinds, but its focal meaning by the end of the 18th century is really the natural disaster. Lord Mansfield and other late 18th century jurists describe the act of God as such acts as could not happen by the intervention of man, as storms, lightning, and tempests. And just to give you a sense of the latest legal definition, this is from Black's Law Dictionary, the 8th edition. It's an overwhelming, unpreventable event caused exclusively by forces of nature, such as an earthquake, flood, or tornado. There still is wrangling going on about this, but for our purposes, it's focally, prototypically, a natural disaster. But the import of more recent British and US case law has extended the term to cover almost any event that was merely unforeseeable, at least to such an extent that no human prevention was possible. And so there are all kinds of cases on the books about jettisoning cargo at sea to save human lives and the like. I'll spare you these cases because I'll just give you one of them, which is epitomizes the kind of banal situation in which this reverberating term, the act of God, is invoked to almost comically trivial occasions. But this is a British case in which a children's wading pool overflows because of an unusually heavy rain and causes damages to the neighbor's lawn, and the defense is an act of God. This is, needless to say, ruled out of court. The overall import of these cases is to continually narrow what can count as an act of God. So, for example, this is an EPA lawyer writing quite recently, saying that in his 20 years of practice as a lawyer for the EPA, I saw many communities affected by fires, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and other natural disasters. However, I never saw a case where the act of God defense prevailed against environmental liability. And that, I think, is testimony to the fact, the ever-narrowing category of the act of God. So the overall tendency, also in legal commentaries and legal scholarship, has been, wherever possible, to extend the radius of human responsibility. Could the disaster that caused the damages have been foreseen? And if so, could precautions have been taken to mitigate its consequences? Now, foresight is not the same as prediction, and precautions are not the same as prevention. Volcanic eruptions like Krakatoa in 1883 and earthquakes like the one in San Francisco in 1906 still cannot be predicted. They certainly can't be prevented. Humans cannot cause them, and humans cannot stop them. But historical experience and scientific advances have turned devastating surprises into anticipated risks, just as the statistics of workplace compensation have turned bad luck into workplace insurance. So we have, for example, amongst these kinds of technological precautions, the Thames Barrier, erected in 1982, which was meant to withstand a once-in-a-thousand-year storm surge. The very phrase, which we've all become used to employing, worst-case scenario, suggests the degree to which we have all become habituated to imagining and planning for what can neither be predicted nor prevented. Our visions of the future have become haunted by the ever-present prospect of the catastrophe decades before nuclear weapons and the awareness of planetary climate change. We are like Cassandra in the Greek myth. We are able to foresee the future, but we are unable to avert it. But now we have the responsibility to plan for that future. We have become Cassandra with an insurance policy. I began this lecture with an image of 3 sealed boxes symbolizing the supernatural, the natural, and the human. This is a much too tidy metaphysical solution to what the modern mind perceives as the miscellany of causes, ancient and medieval explanations of dreadful accidents that befall us humans, from war to famine, earthquakes to bandits, instead of invoking divine wrath, human perfidy, and natural processes all at once for one and the same event. This is a metaphor or an allegory for the Enlightenment metaphysics that demanded a strict sorting of those causes amongst these 3 boxes. And one consequence was that some disasters, for example, earthquakes, became natural and only natural, and others, for example, pirates, became human and only human. Now, in principle, the God's box is the largest of all, and it could have included the other two boxes, but just because God was responsible for everything, he ended up being responsible for nothing. In a sense, he became the victim of his own divine rule of law, and many historians have pointed out the analogy between this political theology in which God more or less agrees to be bound by his own natural laws, and the constitutional monarchy, which has turned the office of the monarch into a merely symbolic or ceremonial office. The efforts to keep these three boxes truly separated, one from the other, have resulted in a frenzy of border drawing, which you might liken to the way in which the Congress of Vienna, after the Napoleonic Wars, tried to carve up Europe. Over and over again, philosophers, scientists, poets, even judges and lawyers have tried to ring fence the realm of nature, especially nature on the rampage, despite the temptation to recruit nature for human purposes, whether or not it's to support Malthusian policies toward the poor or to free insurance companies from their obligation to pay claims. To plead force majeure of nature, whether in politics or in the law courts, is to exonerate humans of all responsibility. And conversely, to seek ethical meaning in nature was at best pointless and at worst cruel. It seemed to be a way of blaming the victims of Krakatoa or San Francisco. And this frenzy of boundary drawing has generated any number of modern finger-wagging fallacies, such as the pathetic fallacy in literature, the naturalistic fallacy in politics, to name just two of the most prominent such prohibitions. So the pathetic fallacy, coined by John Ruskin in 1856, was his somewhat dyspeptic accusation that poets should not try to personify nature. Many poets objected this would mean getting rid of poetry altogether. And the naturalistic fallacy nowadays means, it did not mean this originally, nowadays means invoking the authority of nature to justify or to criticize human arrangements. There are many other examples that I could cite of this attempt to erect a barbed wire fence between nature and ethics. And I think the only moral that one might want to draw here is that, just as in the case of barbed wire fences that separate any two realms, the reason for the barbed wire fence is there is a constant temptation to transgress these boundaries. And we are still very much living in an epoch in which the official metaphysics, or at least the official Enlightenment metaphysics, is very much at odds sometimes with people's everyday intuitions. More about that in the third lecture. I'd like to conclude by returning to William James on the Stanford campus in 1906, in April of 1906. James, after he had experienced the earthquake and seen the damage in San Francisco, began to reflect on his experience as a psychologist. He began to introspect about his own reactions to the earthquake, and he began to interview a lot of other people, a lot of the other survivors of the earthquake. So there's William James. He's kneeling on the floor of his rented Palo Alto digs as the ground rocks beneath his feet and the earthquake roars like thunder. He claims that he felt no fear during the actual quake that lasted about 45 seconds. And this self-observation was independently confirmed by quite a number of other people. They seem to have had quite a few other emotions. For example, they experienced incredulity, suspense, when is it going to end? Is it going to end? Some said that they experienced elation, and others said that their foremost thought, this happened very early in the morning, was embarrassment that they were going to have to go outside undressed. But James was immediately and vividly conscious of the earthquake as an adversary. He wrote, "It stole in behind my back, and once inside the room, had me all to itself, and could manifest itself convincingly. Animus and intent were never more present in any human action. All whom I consulted on this point agreed as to this feature of their experience. It expressed intention. It was vicious. It was bent on destruction. It wanted to show its power." The earthquake of James's, and not only James's, imagination was neither a wrathful God nor motherly nature, but something more like a wild beast of prey lying in wait to ambush him. It was morally unaccountable and all the more dangerous for that. It was evil without intent, rapacious without responsibility. Anyone could fall prey to its violence, just as anyone could be waylaid by a wild animal. Natural disasters were crimes without culprits. In recent decades, this image of natural disasters as a no-blame zone has undergone a radical revision. Nature is as violently destructive as ever, indeed more so as densely populated settlements spring up in geologically active regions, and the frequency and intensity of storms, floods, and wildfires are on the rise as a result of planetary climate change. The 2023 earthquake in Turkey and Syria probably killed more people than the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, and the 25 strongest hurricanes, as measured by wind speed, since records began in 1851, have occurred since 1980. But now newspaper headlines talk about nature's revenge, and editorials in leading scientific journals reject the label natural disaster for hurricanes like Katrina. Natural disasters are becoming unnatural, or rather, they're artificial in the sense of being man-made. So instead of crimes without culprits, there are now culprits aplenty. So there are the corrupt officials who didn't enforce the building codes in the earthquake zones. There are the greedy developers who cleared away the trees to make way for new homes, and in so doing, cleared the way for mudslides. Or there's all of us who drive gas-guzzling cars that belch CO2 into a warming atmosphere. So instead of blameless misfortune, nowadays there's more than enough blame to go around. In 1980, no one, according to the New York Times, was to blame for the volcanic eruption of Mount St. Helens. By 2005, someone was very much to blame for Hurricane Katrina, and by 2024, everyone may well be to blame for the catastrophes unleashed by global warming. And in my third and last lecture, I'll look at how the sea change in attitudes toward natural disasters and blame is affecting liability law and insurance. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for another fascinating lecture. I know there are infinite questions in this room. We only have time for a few. Please raise your hand, and I will do my best to call on as many people as possible. I know Professor Daston is also excited for your questions. He said that he values enormously. This is what
Thanks again, Daston, for I think it's on. Sorry about that. Thank you again for another wonderful lecture. As I was listening to this, I was thinking about another earthquake that happened sort of 17 years after the Great San Francisco conflagration, an earthquake, and it made me think about sort of, if nature is not to blame, then it sort of creates this crime without a culprit, creates this kind of state in which it's very easy, it becomes very easy and instantaneous to ascribe culpability. And the instance I'm thinking of is the 1923 Kanto earthquake in Japan, for instance.
Yes.
They all accepted that this is some sort of, you can't blame nature or God for this, but we'll just go after the Koreans and the communists, the socialists, and this happens within hours and days. And so I'm sort of curious, yes, it is a crime without culprits, but then isn't the kind of, that sort of, from a history of emotions perspective, that energy, that volition to try to find a culprit immediately thereafter, isn't that still part of the rationale? Or?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, we were talking about this at lunch today, that there is, this narrative of blame has a certain momentum of its own. And in a sense, I have been talking about the more respectable intellectual history. When I talk about people like John Stuart Mill or Thomas Henry Huxley. But I agree with you. There is an undertow of that narrative always waiting to emerge. I think this was also apropos of Japan, the 2011 tragedy of the earthquake and the resulting tsunami, and then the meltdown at Fukushima of the nuclear reactor. And I think something like 15,000 people died in the tsunami. I don't know the exact number of deaths directly attributed to Fukushima, but it's probably something like a dozen, certainly under 20. And nonetheless, that whole episode has been epitomized by the word Fukushima, the only part of that tragedy for which humans might be blamed. And I do not think that is an accident. I also think that the entire discussion, obviously politically motivated, but all of these narratives are always politically motivated, about the lab in China, in Wuhan, that has suspected, whether correctly or incorrectly, I have no evidence that would lead me to form a decisive conclusion, but nonetheless, the obsessive attention to that hypothesis also suggests to me a deep willingness, a will to believe a narrative where someone can be blamed.
Joanna Radin.
Thank you, Professor Daston. I at the risk of short-circuiting where you're going next, for the third talk, I just wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about property. And, your attention to insurance kind of begs the question also of shifting ideas of property and ownership over the long time period that you're talking about. And I think about different kinds of relationships to the land, different, human-land relations, is thinking of, in Hawaii, Pele, the lava is a teacher, and different kinds of ideas. And I just wanted to hear you say some more about shifting notions of property alongside these shifting ideas of culpability and responsibility leading to the rise of insurance.
I think for the purposes of the insurance companies, which are very much lodged within a capitalist system of legal property ownership, the most important change has been the conceptualization of the responsibilities of the state for what otherwise would be considered private property. So let me just give the example of FEMA in the United States. So long before anyone was willing to accept anthropogenic climate change, it was quite evident to the insurance companies by the 1970s that something was wrong with the weather. And you can see this in the minutes of the Swiss Insurance Executive Board. The floods are recurring ever more frequently, and they try to get out of some of the U.S. markets. And that because they're one of the world's biggest reinsurers, that puts pressure on the primary insurers, the kinds of people we buy insurance from, to do the same. That means that the people who own property in these flood zones are left without affordable insurance options. And the state steps in, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And very quickly, FEMA is going bankrupt as it would, because they are offering subsidized rates. So the idea of property here is an extremely murky one, in which the property, these homeowners own the deed, they own the house, etc. On the other hand, the state has stepped in to shield their property, and also, it must be said, to draw the sting of moral hazard of rebuilding and rebuilding and rebuilding in the flood zone when FEMA attempted to just slightly raise its premium, already highly subsidized premium, to the point that it somewhat sent a signal that maybe it wasn't a good idea to rebuild your home. There were massive protests against this. So yes, I think what's happening, and this will be a theme of the third lecture, is that we're seeing, even in the most capitalistic countries in the United States, a kind of socialization of property when it comes to accepting the risk.
Thank you.
Hi, Charlotte Lab, History Department and PhD candidate. My research takes me to the New Jersey Meadowlands over the Boundary currently, and in the 1850s, after the end of the Little Ice Age, the salt pane farmers there, they begin to realize that their land is flooding more and more. And so I think this is more of a prompt for you as you continue to take Mark Peterson's advice potentially yesterday and look at the different attributes of disasters, to look back into that 1850 to 1900 moment in more particular, because I think the San Francisco earthquake, is one example of a kind of event where insurance plays a big role, but the railroad companies and the end of the Little Ice Age in tandem after 1850 are affecting sea level in places like New Jersey and New York Harbor. And some people are taking note. And so I think it was a wonderful talk. And as a landscape historian, environmental historian, I wonder if you have anything more to say or any research in your back pocket more about floods and the ways that people interrogate their capacity to change power relations or express developing power relations, as in the one between a salt hay farmer who's farming hay on a meadow and a railroad company who is disrupting that plan of action as sea levels are rising.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for that example, which I don't know anything about, so I have nothing to contribute to that particular example. But I think the environmental history must be absolutely peppered with such examples. And what really interests me, and you're absolutely right to bring up the very illuminating comment about the Spanish reaction to the savage hurricane season of the Caribbean, is the way in which certain situations become normalized. So situations which start off as states of exception become normalized. Now, the real question is, when they become normalized so that you can actually predict floods, what is the reaction of both the state and insurers? And the state here considered, in response to Joanna Raven's question, the insurer of last resort. Insurers, the one kind of insurance that's almost impossible to get is flood insurance. And one reason is that floods in certain parts of the world, certainly in Northern Europe, have become so regular, not predictable, but so regular in occurrence, they no longer have the kind of statistical qualities which are required to make them a good bet for insurance. So basically, it's forced homeowners in Northern Europe, because their governments have not stepped in to insure them, to become their own self-insurers. So you can have events which are so regular that the insurance company can't insure them, or you can have events which are so irregular, like earthquakes, that the insurance companies won't insure them. So there's an interplay going on to find the sweet spot for the insurance companies where a risk is just infrequent and unpredictable enough that they'll take the bet on it, but not so long-term that it will suddenly devastate, it will exhaust all of their reserves. So it would really interest me in your case, the 1850s case, the point at which the insurance companies start to back out of this business.
Yeah, nothing is being insured at that point in these meadows. So
I see, so that it's not an area. It's interesting because one of the really fascinating things about insurance in the late 19th century and the early 20th century is the unbelievable creativity of the insurers. In the annals of insurance, you know, at least in Great Britain, you can buy insurance to have sunshine for the afternoon of your wedding. And it's called fluvial insurance. And so let's say it's an outdoor event. You can buy insurance from 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, that it's not going to rain. There are forms of insurance for your vacation, that there will be guaranteed good weather on your vacation. And if not, the insurance company will pay up. So usually insurance, they're the first people to decide that you could have insurance for almost anything. So it's always interesting to me where the insurers do not decide to intervene. And it's usually for a reason which has to do with the perceived risk-benefit analysis.
Well, so the insurance industry pulling out seems like an ominous note to end on, but probably quite appropriate. And we have to wait 2 days for the next installment of the lectures. I want to remind you all that we will be in Rosenfeld 109, not here, on Friday at 4:30. Please join me once again in thanking Professor Daston for her second lecture.